So I have a quick question to ask you. Have you ever thought about starting a reading habit? Or maybe you're a once in every blue moon type of reader, but you want to be more consistent and maintain a reading habit. Or maybe you're an avid reader, but you're interested in having a more intentional and fulfilling reading life. Does that sound like you? If any of those scenarios sound like you in even the slightest, I want to invite you to take the What's Your Reader Type quiz. It will only take 60 seconds of your time and you'll discover your reader type. But most importantly, you'll get the resources you need to start reading, maintain the habit, and get intentional. So visit readertypequiz.com. That's readertypequiz.com. It will only take you 60 seconds and you'll discover your reader type and get the resources you need. So whether you're an aspiring or avid reader, go to readertypequiz.com, spend 60 seconds and take the quiz that will help you get clear on where you are right now and what you need to do to live your best reading and literary life yet. Hello. I'm Victoria from Biblio Lifestyle, and you're listening to the Reader's Couch podcast, the show that will help you bridge the gap between living a full and busy life to one where you're reading, learning new things, and having fun. Today on the couch, I'm so happy to welcome author Charlotte Fox Weber to talk about her new book, Tell Me What You Want. A therapist and her client explore our 12 deepest desires. Now, Charlotte Fox Weber is a psychotherapist currently working in private practice, and we discuss the 12 universal desires she shared in her book that we all have and want. Now, in the introduction of this book, there's a paragraph that really stuck out to me, and I'll read it for you here. We all have wants, and we're all conflicted. We show some of our wants, but others we hide, even from our own awareness. Our deep desires frighten us and excite us. We're afraid of failing, and we're anxious about succeeding. Recognizing and understanding what we want helps us to face ourselves without flinching and galvanizes us to live lives that are more fulfilling and joyful. Well, readers, I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty spot on to me, especially because I think it's fair to say each of us at certain moments in our life can feel lost or confused, and we might even start asking ourselves, what do we really want? So in this episode, Charlotte and I talk about her book and the 12 desires. These desires are to love and be loved, desire, understanding, power, attention, freedom, to create, to belong, to win, to connect, wanting what we shouldn't, and control. In this book, Charlotte provides a lot of insight about our desires, and through the client examples, you'll also see change and growth, and by the end, hopefully, you'll feel empowered and inspired. Charlotte and I also talk about her inspiration to write this book. We talk about the book she recently reread, her favorite bookstores, and lots more. So let's get into the episode so you can listen to my chat with author Charlotte Fox Weber. Where were you the last weekend of April 2023? Well, I don't know about you, but hundreds of readers and myself had a fantastic 3 days at the Spring Summer Epigraph Literary Festival. It was really a great time. Oh my gosh. Authors were sharing about their new books. I was laughing so hard during the happy hours, and I learned so many new things at our lifestyle-themed sessions. So, if you missed the festival, or you want to relive the highlights, visit EPIGRAPHLitFest.com and select replays. That's epigraphlitfest.com and select replays. Your TBR will explode, you'll learn a thing or two, and you'll have lots of laughs, especially at those happy hour sessions. So go to epigraphlitfest.com and select replays. Hi readers, welcome again to the Reader's Couch. I'm your host, Victoria Wood, and here on the couch with me is a psychotherapist currently working in private practice, but she's also co-founded Examined Life and was the founding head of the School of Life Psychotherapy. But she's here on the couch with me to talk about her new book, Tell Me What You Want. Please welcome to the couch, Charlotte Fox Weber. Hi, Charlotte.
Hello.
So happy to have you here. Excited to talk about your new book, Tell Me What You Want. But I want them to hear it straight from you, Charlotte. Tell us about your book, Tell Me What You Want, and what can readers expect when they pick up your book?
My book is about our hidden desires, and it comes from my own frustration with psychotherapy. I think I'm what you could call a psychotherapy romantic. I have had loads of personal psychotherapy starting when I was 6 years old, and I was always frustrated by the lack of discussion about what I really wanted. I felt like therapy was an opportunity to dig deep and look at what really mattered, and therapists were always more comfortable dwelling in what was wrong than looking at what I might actually seek out of life and out of various situations. And when I became a psychotherapist, I discovered that discussing desire with people brought something alive. There was an agitation and a kind of conflict that was actually worth leaning into. And I think that desire opens us up to fresh possibilities.
In your book, you've summarized and gathered some universal desires that we share as humans, something that we all have and we want. And these desires are to love and to be loved, desire itself, understanding, power, attention, freedom, to create, to belong, to win, to connect, to control, and wanting what we shouldn't want. Now, outside of your own personal experience and frustrations with, no one really asking you what you want, I'm really curious on your decision to put together this book. And also, just can you briefly explain each of these desires and how you came to this conclusion of 12?
Yes, I found that whatever the circumstances, and I've worked with people at various stages and ages of life, and I found that there were recurring themes. So the details vary, but there is very often a longing to be recognized, and a lot of those desires that you've just mentioned have to do with recognition, leaving a mark, being seen. And I think we're constantly negotiating the wish to be recognized, but then the shame that comes with that and not knowing how to go about it, not knowing how to even face it in ourselves. And it's part of being alive, negotiating that struggle and figuring out the rules. And we're always straddling the rules of desire and kind of figuring out what we're allowed to reveal and what we should keep hidden. And a lot of that comes out in fascinating ways in therapy.
Absolutely. Now, the stories you've shared in your book, they're all based on real people that you've encountered in your work. Of course, you've changed all details about them, identifying details in order to maintain confidentiality. But I'm really curious, in a world where I feel there are just so many distractions out there, Charlotte, it's easy to get stuck in the past. I see so many people being stuck in the past. It's so easy to avoid the present. It's so easy to self-sabotage. And just like you mentioned, we are in a society where folks will feel shame, will feel guilt to actually admit what they want and desire. So my question is, how can we know what we really want out of life, and how can we then choose from, this list, this laundry list of wants, and how can we prioritize what matters? So how can we really know what we want, but then also how can we prioritize what matters?
So I think it begins with a very simple question, which shockingly, I had not asked myself, and many people have not asked themselves. When you're in a situation, what is it that you want from that situation? So that may sound just staggeringly obvious, but I think it's easier to kind of get ourselves into muddles and be frustrated and preoccupied with an obstacle rather than think about what it is we want. So if you're in a work situation, if you ask yourself, what do you want from your work? You may be amazed to discover that you have some sense of what it is that you want to create more, that you want power, that you want to connect, whatever it is. I think it's worth starting with the questions themselves. And for those of you who really struggle to stay with those questions, I think sometimes going through a side door entrance can be a lot easier for desire. So rather than just ask yourself what you want, go to the opposite and ask yourself what most frustrates you, or ask yourself what most scares you. And I think through opposites, you come up with amazing illuminations. So if you're incredibly frustrated by a colleague at work, what's behind that frustration? What is it that you would really like that you're not achieving? And I think that frustrations can be a great invitation.
To get to really what we desire. Yep, I actually agree with that 100%. But here's also another problem is that we often lie to ourselves. You know, why do we lie to ourselves? What does it really mean for us to kind of dig deep and discover our true selves? Because I think you're right. We often don't really ask ourselves what we want. A good entry point, like you just shared, is maybe starting with our frustrations. But I think as, you know, as humans, it's really easy to lie to ourselves. So, why do we do this, and what would it mean for us to uncover what we really want?
I think that we're terrified of discovering that we will be found out as fools, or that we won't get what we want. So desire and fear are very closely connected, which is why I think fear can be another way into discovering what it is you want. Because what you most want, you're probably frightened of. And I think accepting limitation is a big part of the work. And one of the pernicious myths that is so common these days is fulfillment. And we think that we're going to have utter total fulfillment, but it's almost this kind of utopia that we've come up with, like that one day we'll have everything we want. And I think that when you face what you want and you actually pursue some of it, then there's this discovery of limitation, which can be quite disappointing. And I think that if you accept that you're never going to get everything you want, it's paradoxical, and I really encourage a paradoxical mindset in all of this. If you accept that not everything will go your way, then actually quite a lot is possible. But we lie to ourselves because we are so afraid of pursuing what we want and discovering that it's not actually as perfect as we imagine.
It's also easy for folks to complain than actually say, I want. Do you find this to be the case?
Absolutely, because there's something about the responsibility that is terrifying. And responsibility is an interesting thing. I think when you hear the word responsibility, it doesn't sound very fun. I don't know about you, what comes up when you hear the word responsibility, but it sounds like a major chore. And yet a lot of us feel responsible for other people. We'll feel responsible for just about everything, but then we don't want to be responsible for our own lives. And yet it's up to each of us to be responsible for thinking about what we want. It's not going to just happen. No one else is going to give us everything that we want. It is for us to do what we can.
As best we can. I think another thing, compromise. Compromise is often seen by society as, you know, a dirty word, but I don't think compromising is a bad thing. Even if you're trying to pursue your true desires and wants, if you're being 100% honest with yourself and saying, well, this is what I want, compromising and getting some of it as opposed to none of it, I think, can work if you're happy and pleased with it. I don't think compromise is a bad thing, but often folks would tell me, well, you're just settling. What would you say to that?
I would say a compromise and flexibility are wonderful things. And flexibility often requires negotiating with the fantasy you have about something. So if you imagine a great love story, Or even if on a small scale you imagine going for dinner with someone and you picture how great it will be and how you'll be charming and that person will be charming and the conversation is going to be brilliant. Flexibility is essential for allowing an experience to be whatever it is. And I mean, along with compromise, as you say, I mean, it's real lived experience. So I think it's adjusting to the twists and turns of life. But I think some of us are so petrified of compromise and flexibility that we preserve this kind of fantasy image of something we really, really want and dare not pursue. So one example that comes to mind is writing this book. I wanted to write this book for years and years, but I didn't even say it out loud. And I think part of that was that if I didn't ever go about writing it, then it could be this incredible book that I would never write. And I, I mean, if that sounds bananas, it kind of is, but it's also it's also how I think a lot of us are about the things that are so precious to us, so precious that we dare not bring it into reality. And and then going about writing this book required allowing for imperfection and allowing for real life to happen. And it's messier than what has never come into existence. It's something that's nuanced and that allows for surprise.
I agree with that, and I think it's a common sentiment, especially I have a podcast about books and reading and lifestyle, and we speak with authors, and many were even scared for years just to admit that I am writing a book.
It's so hard. It's so hard to even say that sentence.
Yes, it's absolutely true. And even with my own self, it was really hard to say, well, I love reading, I love books. One day I want to, work in publishing or do something, because it was not met with approval. It was not seen as practical, and I was afraid.
Yes, yes. So I think that discussing these things in therapy where it's okay to take that risk allows for something to open up.
Absolutely. Again, you've shared these 12 universal desires that you think we all have in common as humans. A few of them stuck out to me in particular. Well, the first one was to love and be loved, and in this case, use Tessa as an example. And that was a really hard read, just because I was trying to put myself in, your position. You were a new student. You went to this hospital. You meet this woman. She's on a terminally ill ward, and to hear this fabulous life, this full life this woman has lived, but in the end, Tessa had one big regret about her boys, and it was just so simple. Tessa wanted to love and also be loved, and share her love and not hold it back. And just I saw so much commonality there, and I have to say it stopped me in my tracks. Would you mind sharing with our listeners a bit about Tessa and the takeaway from that chapter?
Yes, Tessa was my first patient ever, and I I firstly adored her. I did not hold back from letting myself feel a kind of closeness and tenderness towards her. Part of that was my own ego. I, as a psychotherapy romantic, wanted to be incredibly helpful. And I believed so wholeheartedly in psychotherapy that I thought, I will make her dreams come true in some way. So when I worked with her bedside, she talked about her longing, her desperation to snuggle her children. And her two sons were grown up and they were on their way to visiting her. And I wanted so badly, I still feel the longing in me as I sit here telling you about it. I wanted to have it come true. I wanted to have her tell them how much she loved them and voice her regret and be close with them. And she wasn't willing to fake it because it was simply too late. And their dynamic was their dynamic. And as she lay dying, she did have a different experience. She opened herself to me and to herself in an astounding way. But she also was honest about her regret. And I think regret is something that we're so uncomfortable with. we think that we can get out of it. And there's a lot of talk these days about bedside regrets, not bedside regrets, deathbed
Mhm.
regret. And, learn from the people who are dying, learn about how to avoid regret, how to live a life of no regrets. And actually, what I learned from her was to lean into the regret, to accept that we will get it wrong, and that's part of living. And she regretted that she hadn't given in more, that she'd held back from loving and being close. And those aren't the regrets that I will necessarily have, or that you'll necessarily have, but there will be other regrets if we're honest with ourselves. And I think there's something about facing regret, and even anticipating regret, that comes as an enormous relief, because we can then accept that life is not something that you can solve.
No, it's not a puzzle. And, there is no perfect fit for each piece. And another thing that stuck out to me, and it's actually, the last chapter in the book, because there is a chapter, you guys, dedicated to each of these desires. And there's also a story that accompanies it. What I found fascinating was the last one, wanting what we shouldn't want. So this chapter opens with this ski instructor saying, well, I remove my ring before instructing certain clients to avoid them necessarily coming on to him. Which in my eyes, in just me reading, was bonkers. It made no sense. It was
It's
baffling to
true.
me.
It's true.
I was just like, there is no way. But you also go on to speak on something I think is incredibly important, which is the conflicting messages of yes and no. And then Alice was a client who, if my memory serves me right, you can correct me, that I think she was the longest client you had, like longest over time,
Yes.
sharing her story. But I want us to, one, start with the ski instructor, because that was just confusing to me. Conflicting yeses and nos, and then we can talk a bit about Alice.
We want to do what we should. So one of the things that you can discover about yourself is how often you do something because you should, not because you want to. But you should get a birthday present for your friend because the friend expects it and you're in this dynamic, not because you actually want to get a present for this friend. And there's that sense of obligation and pressure, but then there's another part of all of us, to varying degrees, that wants to act out and rebel and be independent. And I think that's where there's a lot of erotic thrill for most people in various ways, but wanting someone who's off limits, wanting to fantasize about having sex with someone who is completely inappropriate. It doesn't mean that you would necessarily do it. It doesn't mean it's a good idea, but there is something about the taboo and what's wrong that is incredibly exciting, and what's wrong can feel right. And I think that we don't necessarily deal with this in a straightforward way, or even understand it about ourselves. And sometimes just sitting with it and understanding it is incredibly liberating. So without just making it erotic, think about the last time you said yes when you actually secretly meant to say no or wanted to say no. Like, do you like that? And you say yes because you want to be agreeable, or because you think that everyone around you will laugh at you if you say no. And I think calling ourselves out for the ways we pretend and the ways we say yes when we mean no can be endlessly fascinating.
I've also noticed, especially through reading your book, that there seems to be a fear of desire. So it's like people are so afraid to be honest and admit that they desire these things, especially when it's something that conflicts with not just how they're seen and perceived in society, but even with their own internal beliefs and values. So they might believe, you should live life a certain way, even though they secretly desire to do something that goes completely against the grain. Why is that the case, do you think?
I think that we are overwhelmed by desire, and we think that it must match the sense we have of ourselves. And very often it doesn't, because desire goes in all sorts of directions. And one of the things I discovered while writing this book is that desire is full of surprises and actually requires surprise and is inconsistent. And I think that in our sense of self, we demand consistency. So we can think, oh, I want this because it's what I've always wanted, when actually we can change our minds. And once we realize that, it is liberating. So, okay, I signed up for marriage and becoming a parent, and that was what I wanted, and it's still what I value. But it turns out that I actually really also want to be creative. That's something that can come as a massive shock. And sometimes people need encouragement and they need inspiration, but it's overwhelming and even frightening because it's not the picture that has always been in place. So I think that it's really about the tensions of changing but also staying the same. I think that we are freaked out about change.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, readers, I hope you will tell me what you want to go. I think it will provide you with a lot of insight. Each chapter has client examples, and you'll see these clients as they change, as they grow, and hopefully at the end, you'll have some clarity at the end of each chapter. But Charlotte, I really want to get into your writing life really quick. You mentioned earlier that you've always wanted to write this book, even though it took you some time to admit it. But how long did it take for you to write Tell Me What You Want? And what kind of research did you do, and client studies to kind of pull it together?
I took about 2 years to write the book. I did my research from looking at a lot of client material, and I wanted to be true to how therapy really happens and the subtleties of what goes on in the consulting room and how change really occurs. And I transposed materials so that everything that's there is from actual clinical work, but it's been moved so that I didn't have to compromise confidentiality.
Absolutely. So, seeing that you again mentioned that you wanted to write a book, now that you've done it, looking back, if you could tell your younger writing self anything, what would it be?
It would be, don't be so afraid of ego. I think that ego is our amigo. I don't think that it's a dirty word. And I think it's not the same as narcissism. But I think a big part of what gets in our way when it comes to desire is that it sounds egotistical to say, I want to be creative or I want power. Like these things sound appalling. And maybe creative doesn't sound appalling. It sounds kind of foolish. And I think that there is a lot to be said for just owning ego. And that doesn't mean that we have to just kind of be silly and obscene and think we have nothing to learn. But I think that a bit of ego is actually a really wonderful, noble thing. And I I think that when we have ego strength, we can recognize how much we have to learn from other people, and there can be humility along with that. But it does take some ego to write because you have to think, okay, my words might matter just a little bit. So I think I would say to my younger self, just admit that there's a little bit of ego in this.
Right, absolutely. All right, so I want to get into your reading life really quick, Charlotte, because even though we're here to talk about your new book, Tell Me What You Want, we also want to know what you're reading. So tell me about the last book or books that you finished reading that you'd now recommend.
So I just reread for maybe the 50th time Breakfast at Tiffany's. And it has nothing to do with psychotherapy. And I think, I mean, I'm constantly reading psychotherapy papers, but I think that I learn more about human motivation from literature. Actually, I think that fiction is just always worthwhile for me. And I think Truman Capote writes like a dream, and it's so beautifully written, and it's so sad. It's just heartbreaking.
It is, it is. It's been a while. I'm overdue a reread, but what I'm really fascinated about is the fact that you've reread it so many times. So if you don't mind me asking, what makes you revisit this book? Because there's this ongoing debate. I'm always talking about it, rereading books when there's so many other books to read, but I love rereading books. So I
I
want to know what motivates you.
I love rereading probably because of the push and pull of change. I like familiarity, but I also like going back to former versions of myself and revisiting something. So one of the things that therapy does is look at a story that you might have told 50 times and reconsidering the story from a different angle, and it can be a massive breakthrough when you tell a story, like if you tell a story about a memory you had from when you were 15 and suddenly you see something in a slightly different way. And I think that's what can happen when you reread a book that you know incredibly well. You see something different. And with Breakfast at Tiffany's, I reconsidered the quest for freedom. And I think I suddenly appreciated Holly Golightly's absolute love and terror of freedom and how difficult it is for her to form attachments.
Right, right, absolutely. So, in addition to books, we love our favorite indie bookstores. So, if you don't mind, I'd love for you to share with our listeners a favorite or two indie bookstores of yours.
Oh, I would say I love Daunt Books in the UK, but I feel bad saying that because you're in Florida.
It's okay. I love Dance, by the way. They are beautiful.
They are. And you go in there and it's a whole world. You feel like suddenly there's this vast expanse and something new is possible.
Amazing. Love it. Okay, Charlotte, kind of wrapping things together. I know you've done your job. You've given us this wonderful resource. And I hope readers, again, will give this one a go. But in an ideal world, what are you hoping readers might think or feel or even learn after they've turned the last page of Tell Me What You Want?
I hope that readers will discover that something is always possible. No matter what the circumstances, there is always a shift that can occur. And I think that it's a really dangerous myth to think that total fulfillment is possible. And once we let go of that myth, then there's this discovery of fresh experience. And it could be the experience of having a really charming conversation with someone at a checkout line in a grocery store. It could be reading a sentence and discovering a new word. It can be something small but profound. And I think each of the characters in my book has profound realizations that might look subtle as it plays out in real life, but it's incredibly liberating. And I think that when we can be at ease with our own turmoil, a lot is possible.
A lot is possible indeed. Charlotte, thank you so much for coming on the show and speaking with me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to the Reader's Couch podcast. Please subscribe to the show, share it with a friend, and take a few seconds to leave a rating and review. Until next time, stay lounging, stay reading, and whenever you're in doubt, go straight to your local bookstore or library. Thanks again for listening, and happy reading.